Tale Foundry.
We've been talking a lot about fantasy this month. In our last video, we used Game of Thrones as a sort of lens through which to look at the genre, to show by example how fantasy settings and fictional worlds can be more than just entertainment. What we didn't do was talk about the actual world of Game of Thrones, and since our theme this month is Game of Thrones, it might be the only real chance we get, so you better believe we're going to exploit it. Now, before we start, you should know that this world is, massive. Huge, utterly gigantic, and the lore goes so deep, we'd have to do like a 100-hour-long video to cover it all, which, believe it or not, we're not super keen on doing. So we're going to try and keep it pretty broad. Here are the 3 cornerstones we believe the world of Game of Thrones was built on. Number 3. Although realism is definitely not a prerequisite to good world building, one of the most important things a writer can do to develop a fictional world is study the world we live in. And in the real world, everything sort of revolves around geography. Towns spring up around rivers, tourist attractions create economies. George R.R. Martin must have known this while he was crafting the world of Game of Thrones, because this concept pervades just about every part of that universe. Every culture you look at seems to have developed around some kind of landmark. The horseback-riding Dothraki savages dominate an endless ocean of tall grass called the Dothraki Sea, where they both find their mounts and use them to run down neighboring cultures. The Ironborn, traditionally pirates and raiders, inhabit a group of small, treacherous islands called the Iron Isles, which act as a hub for their questionable activities and an inspiration for their strange religion. Qarth, an ancient and pristine trade city, has gone unbesieged for millennia, not only because of its great walls, but also because it was built within a coastal oasis, surrounded by an impassable desert called the Red Waste. There are literally hundreds of examples of this throughout the world. The geography is woven so beautifully into the culture, the history, and the overall lore, it's actually really easy to miss the important role that it plays. As a matter of fact, the book series, A Song of Ice and Fire, gets its namesake from a conflict that wouldn't exist without the world's very specific geography. First, the ice. There's a region in the far, far north of the world, well beyond the reach of any civilized culture, where winter never ends. It's a wasteland of snow and ice, with temperatures so cold, no living creature could possibly endure them. And yet, there are still those who call this hellish landscape their home. Creatures so brutal and relentless that the peoples living on their border came together to construct a 700-foot-tall wall just to keep them at bay. These mysterious creatures are often referred to as White Walkers, or simply, the Others. Then, there's the fire. Long ago, much of the world was conquered by a powerful empire called the Valyrian Freehold, but they didn't do it with armies or advanced weapons. Instead, they used something that they found in the mountains of their homeland, a secret hidden amongst a range of active volcanoes that they called the 14 Fires. There, they discovered dragons. Unfortunately, in a fit of poetic justice, those same volcanoes eventually erupted, destroying the Valyrian capital and its dragons, and bringing an end to their 5,000-year reign. All that remains of the empire is 3 young dragons. We have yet to see whether they'll be enough to stop the White Walkers, but it's interesting to think about how something as simple as the layout of the world can lead to such incredible circumstances. Number 2. Although geography is, as we pointed out, one of the most important parts of world building, landmarks and settings don't really mean much without people to interact with them. A world doesn't really start to live until people start to live in it. And this is why the development of cultures is so crucial to an engaging fictional world. They allow writers to imbue the setting with purpose and meaning, to show the audience what the world and the story are about, without having to spoon-feed it to them. Game of Thrones takes full advantage of this concept, and does so in a really effective way. Pretty much all of the cultures in Game of Thrones seem to have their own very strong, consistent aesthetic, an overarching style or feel that defines them. The Wildlings, for example, tribes of people who live out in the harsh cold of the northern wilderness. Some are savages, some are nomads, some just keep to themselves, but they all have one thing in common: freedom. They call themselves the Free Folk because they aren't pledged to any lords or noble houses. They live how they want to, unfettered by the laws of man. In a far distant part of the world, there's also the free city of Braavos, which has a very open melting pot culture, a culture that is ultimately dominated by passion and bravado. Courtesans are treated like nobility, showered with praise and gifts. Swordsmen walk the streets, wearing flamboyant colors in search of opponents to duel. If you wear a sword at night in Braavos, it means you're willing to fight. The Seven Kingdoms are like a big game of chess or a peacock show. The Dothraki are so warlike that their leaders are simply the best fighters from among their ranks. The list goes on and on. Number 1. So, the world of Game of Thrones is defined by its strong, diverse cultures, which are influenced by its geography. But there's another part of the world, a non-physical element, that has everything to do with the story. In the real world, the further back you look into our history, the more mythology and folklore seem to creep into it. And this is true in the world of Game of Thrones as well. Although most of the world's histories and lineages are very detailed and fleshed out, a huge number of them can be traced back to some legend or story so fantastical, it's hard even for the characters in Game of Thrones to believe them. In fact, there's an entire era of historical uncertainty in the West, a period known as the Age of Heroes, that fits this bill. One figure from this era is the Grey King, from whom the Ironborn claim to descend. According to legend, he was the first monarch to rule the Iron Isles. He built his palace from the bones of the giant sea serpent Naga, who he killed with his own hands. He took a mermaid as his bride, so that his children could live both on land and under the waves. He tricked the storm god into striking a tree with lightning so that he could bring the gift of fire to man. And at the end of his long life, he marched into the sea to join the drowned god in his deep hall. But not all of the legends from this time period are so exciting. Some are used more as a means by which to explain things. For example, that 700-foot tall wall we mentioned earlier, quite an architectural feat. Like the Great Pyramids of our world, people really have to wonder how it was built. But the people of the North maintain that a legendary architect, Bran the Builder, is responsible. To keep the White Walkers away, he used whatever resources he could to erect the giant wall, including giants and magic. So, cool. Those are good stories, but that's obviously all they are, right? Well, Game of Thrones does something really cool with its history, where the fantastical legends and folklore of the past stand in stark contrast to the relatively believable present-day world. But, on rare occasion, something will show up in the world that's just as fantastical as anything from the stories, and this has a way of making the world's fantasy feel more real to us. Imagine if you went outside one day and saw a griffin flying through the sky. You'd have to question everything you knew about mythology and fairy tales. It would be very similar to what happens in Game of Thrones. So, those are the 3 essential things that we think really make the world of Game of Thrones tick. Geography, which influences culture. Culture, which creates aesthetics and meaning for the world. And history, which informs the tone of the stories being told in the world. You might have noticed that some of the things we mentioned in this video don't really show up in the TV series. That's because they come from the book series, A Song of Ice and Fire, written by George R.R. Martin. If you like what you heard here, read the books. You'll have 1,000 new ideas a second. Anyway, we've got one last video to do before we wrap up Game of Thrones month, a new Tale Foundry original short story inspired by Game of Thrones. It won't be fanfiction, but it should give you some pretty good ideas on how to use everything we learned from Game of Thrones this month, so be sure to click subscribe so you don't miss it. You can also click submit if you have a story you want us to share. As always, thanks for watching, and keep making stuff up. I'll see you next time.